bit struggling today. I am still improving marginally. Found out how to check post-stream how many people viewed the stream. I had 2 people at a time, might be like a little bit more than 2 people because people might have exchanged. But I had 2 people at a time last stream, and one person stayed for like 45 minutes. So thank you to whoever that was. I'll figure out how to work with the settings better. I don't know. I also found that there are really good audiobooks done by anarchists, as, I don't know, a lot of anarchists tend to do audiobooks, apparently, and this is a well-loved book, so I don't need to do an audiobook. So the point of these recordings is literally just for me to struggle through reading. And that's, I have recently decided, a little embarrassing. But that's okay that it's embarrassing, I guess. Because, I don't know. It means that somebody else might be struggling with it, and that might make it helpful. It's also helpful to me. The embarrassment keeps me accountable, I guess. Because if it's not embarrassing, if it's comfortable to quit, then I just quit. And that's why we're here. So let's continue. Actually, I'm going to blow my nose real quick. We're back. We're back and we're ready and we're going. Okay. Chapter 3, Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied leadership for the American Revolution, that colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen joined by slaves and servants. A rebellion so threatening that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown, and England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to maintain order among 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. Wow. 40,000 colonists. Okay. After the uprising was suppressed, its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, dead, and his associates hanged, Bacon was described in a Royal Commission report. He was said to be about 4 or 5 or 30 years of age. Indifferent. 4 or 5 and 30. So 34, 35. Jesus. Okay. That's interesting that Old English used to... Anyways. Indifferent. Tall but slender. Black-haired and of an ominous, pensive melancholy aspect. Of a persistent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism. This is already a mess. Oh, hey, Pomodoro. Start that. Atheism, that's just how atheism was spelled. There's just an extra E, and I lost it. Oh, okay. He seduced the vulgar and the most ignorant people to believe, 2/3 of each county being of that sort, to believe so that their whole hearts and hopes were set now upon bacon. Next, he charges the governor as negligent and wicked, treacherous and incapable, the laws and taxes as unjust and oppressive, and cries up absolute necessity of redress. Thus, Bacon encouraged the tumult, and as the unquiet crowd follow and adhere to him, he listeth them as they come in upon a larger paper. Okay, he lists them as they come in upon a larger paper, writing their names circular-wise, that their ringleader might not be found out. Having conjured them into the circle, given them brandy to wind up the charm, and enjoined them by an oath to stick fast together and to him, and the oath being administered, he went and infected New Kent County, ripe for rebellion. Bacon's rebellion began with conflict over how to deal with Indians, who were close by on the western front, constantly threatening. Whites who had been ignored when huge land grants around Jamestown were given away had gone west to find land, and there they encountered Indians. Were those frontier Virginians resentful that the politicos and landed aristocrats who controlled the colony's government in Jamestown first pushed them westward into Indian territory and then seemed indecisive in fighting the Indians? That might explain the character of their rebellion, not easily classifiable as either anti-aristocrat or anti-Indian because it was both. And the governor, William Berkeley, and his Jamestown crowd, were they more conciliatory to the Indians? They wooed certain of them as spies and allies. Now that they had monopolized the land in the east, could use frontier whites as buffer and needed space, the desperation of the government in suppressing the rebellion seemed to have a double motive. Developing an Indian policy which would divide Indians in order to control them in New England at this very time. Massasoit? Massasoit. At this very time, Massasoit's son, Metacom, was threatening to unite Indian tribes and had done frightening damages to Puritan settlements in King Philip's War, and teaching the poor whites of Virginia that rebellion did not pay by a show of superior force by calling for troops from England itself by mass hanging. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Doeg Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and whites, retrieving the hogs, murdered 2 Indians. The Doegs then sent out a war party to kill a white herdsman, after which a white militia company killed 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with the Indians outnumbered turning to guerrilla warfare. No, not that Doeg. Okay.
Doeg people.
Doeg. This has a 1-star rating on how to pronounce. We're gonna move on. The House of Burgesses in Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiersmen, who wanted total war, but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war.
Assess.
Okay. Assessed. Why? Why am I dumb? What? Okay. We're struggling today so much. Oh shit, I have a viewer. Oh my god. Okay, I guess that means we've got to continue. This seemed to anger the frontiersmen, who wanted total war but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Times were hard in 1676. There was genuine distress, genuine poverty. All contemporary sources speak of the great mass of people as living in severe economic straits, writes Wilcombe Washburn, who, using British colonial records, has done an exhaustive study of Bacon's rebellion. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop needed for export. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote warily about the situation. How miserable that man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. His phrase, 6 parts of 7, suggests the existence of an upper class not so impoverished. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Bacon himself came from this class. I didn't know that. Had a good bit of land and was probably more enthusiastic about killing Indians than about redressing the grievances of the poor. I knew that. But he became a symbol of mass resentment against the Virginia establishment and was elected in the spring of 1676 to the House of Burgesses. when he insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside official control. Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go, and in return for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon's Declaration of the People of 1776 shows a mixture of populist resentment against the rich and frontier hatred of the Indians. It indicated that the Berkeley administration no it indicted the Berkeley administration for unjust taxes, for putting favorites in high positions, for monopolizing the beaver trade, and for not protecting Western farmers from the Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians, killing 8, taking others prisoner, plundering their possessions. There is evidence that the rank and file of both Bacon's rebel army and Berkeley's official army were not as enthusiastic as their leaders. There were mass desertions on both sides, according to Washburn. In the fall, Bacon, aged 29, fell sick and died because of, as a contemporary put it, swarms of vermin that bred in his body. Oh, okay. What? Okay, swarms of vermin that bred in his body. A minister, apparently not a sympathizer, wrote this epitaph. Bacon is dead. I am sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. The rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruised the York River. Hello, technical issues. Anyways, moving on. I did not know how long the camera was like that. Okay. Bacon died. The rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruised the York River, became the base for securing order, and its captain, Thomas Grantham, used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon the chief garrison of the rebellion, he found 400 armed Englishmen and Negroes, a mixture of freemen, servants, and slaves. He promised to pardon everyone, to give freedom to slaves and servants. Whereupon they surrendered their arms and dispersed, except for 80 Negroes and 20 English, who insisted on keeping their arms. Grantham promised to take them to a garrison down the river, but when they got into the boat, he trained his big gun on them, disarmed them, and eventually delivered the slaves and servants to their masters. The remaining garrisons were overcome one by one. 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a complex chain of oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by white frontiersmen who were taxed and controlled by the Jamestown elite. And the whole colony was being exploited by England, which brought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated, tobacco at prices it dictated and made £100,000 a year for the king. Berkeley himself, returning to England years earlier to protest the English Navigation Act, which gave English merchants a monopoly of the colonial trade, had said, "We cannot but resent that 40,000 people should be impoverished to enrich little more than 40 merchants, who, being the only buyers of our tobacco, give us what they please for it, and after it is here, sell it how they please, and indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates. And indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates than any other men have slaves." From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had the overwhelming support of the Virginia population. A number of his council reported that the defection was almost general, and laid it to the lewd disposition of some persons of desperate fortunes, who had the vain hopes of taking the country wholly out of his Majesty's hands and into their own. Another member of the governor's council, Richard Lee, noted that Bacon's rebellion had started over Indian policy. But the zealous inclination of the multitude to support Bacon was due, he said, to hopes of leveling. Leveling meant equalizing the wealth. Leveling was to be behind countless actions of poor whites against the rich in all the English colonies in the century and a half before the Revolution. The servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserable poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600s, the enclosing of land for the production of wool, filling the cities with vagrant poor. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600s, the enclosing of land for the production of wool, filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them. The Elizabethan definition of rogues and vagabonds included all persons calling themselves scholars, going about begging, all seafaring men pretending losses of their ships or goods on the sea, going about the country begging. All idle persons going about in any country, either begging or using any subtile craft or unlawful games. Common players of interludes and minstrels wandering abroad. All wandering persons and common laborers being persons able in body, using loitering and refusing work for such reasonable wages as is taxed or commonly given. Such persons found begging could be stripped to the waist and whipped bloodily, could be sent out of the city, sent to workhouses, or transported out of the country. In the 1600s and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, lies, and by kidnapping, by their urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, traders, and ship captains, and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, colonists and bondage, writes, from the complex patterns of force producing emigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them. Pecuniary, I say, and I say that it means peculiar. Oh.
Pecuniary.
It does mean pecuniary, but it does not mean peculiar. It means relating to or consisting of money. One moment. Let us carry on. After signing the indenture, in which the immigrants agreed to pay their cost of passage by working for a master for 5 to 7 years, they were often imprisoned until the ship sailed, to make sure they didn't run away. In the year 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America. It was also the year of the first importation of black slaves, provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts between... Thank you. Okay, let's take a break. Already, I need a break. I'm back with a new green tea brewing. Wow, okay, so they agreed to pay their cost of passage and then were imprisoned before the ship set sail. In the year 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America, it was also the year of the first importation of black slaves, provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts between servants and masters. As in any contract between unequal powers, the parties appeared on paper as equals, but enforcement was far easier for masters than for servants. The voyage to America lasted 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and the servants were packed into ships with the same fanatic concern for profits that marked the slave ships. If the weather was bad and the trip took too long, they ran out of food. The sloop Seaflower, leaving Belfast in 1741, was at sea 16 weeks when it arrived in Boston. 46 of its 108 passengers were dead of starvation, 6 of them eaten by survivors. On another trip, 32 children died of hunger and disease and were thrown into the ocean. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a musician traveling from Germany to America around 1750, wrote about his voyage. During the journey, the ship is full of pitiful signs of distress. Smells, fumes, horrors, vomiting, various kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and similar afflictions. All of them caused by the age and the high salted state of the food, especially of the meat, as well as by the very bad and filthy water. Add to all that shortage of food, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, as well as other troubles, on board our ship, on a day on which we had a great storm, a woman about to give birth and unable to deliver under the circumstances, was pushed through one of the portholes into the sea. I assume she had died first. Indentured servants were bought and sold like slaves. An announcement in the Virginia Gazette, March 28, 1771, read, "Just arrived at Leestown. The ship Justia, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sale will commence on Tuesday, the 2nd of April. Against the rosy accounts of better living standards in the Americas, one must place many others against the rosy accounts of better living conditions in the Americas, one must place many others, like one immigrant's letter from America. Whoever is well off in Europe, better remain there. Here is misery and distress, same as everywhere. For certain persons and conditions, incomparably more than in Europe. Beatings and whippings were common. Servant women were raped. One observer testified, "I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head until the blood has flowed, for a fault that is not worth the speaking of." The Maryland court records showed many servant suicides. In 1671, Governor Berkeley of Virginia reported that in previous years, 4 of 5 servants died of disease after their arrival. Many were poor children, gathered up by the hundreds on the streets of English cities and sent to Virginia to work. The master tried to control completely the sexual lives of the servants. It was in his economic interest to keep women servants from marrying or from having sexual relations, because childbearing would interfere with work. Benjamin Franklin, writing as Poor Richard in 1736, gave advice to his readers: "Let thy maidservants be faithful, strong, and homely." Servants could not marry without permission, could be separated from their families, could be whipped for various offenses. Pennsylvania law in the 17th century said that marriage of servants without consent of the masters shall be proceeded against as for adultery or fornication, and children to be reputed as bastards. Although colonial law existed to stop excesses against servants, they were not very well enforced. We learn from Richard Morris's comprehensive study of early court records in Government and Labor in Early America. Servants did not participate in juries, masters did, and being propertyless, servants did not vote. In 1666, a New England court accused a couple of the death of a servant after the mistress had cut off the servant's toes. The jury voted acquittal. In Virginia in the 1660s, a master was convicted of raping 2 women servants. He also was known to beat his own wife and children and had whipped and chained another servant until he died. The master was berated by the court, but specifically cleared on the rape charge, despite overwhelming evidence. Sometimes servants organized rebellions, but one did not find on the mainland the kind of large-scale conspiracies of servants that existed, for instance, on Barbados in the West Indies. Abbott Smith suggested this was because there was more chance of success on a small island. However, in New County, Virginia, in 1661, a servant named Isaac Friend proposed to another, after much dissatisfaction with the food, that they get a matter of 40 of them together and get guns, and he would be the first and lead them and cry as they went along, "Who would be for liberty and free from bondage?" And that there would be enough come to them, and they would go through the country and kill those that made any opposition, and that they would either be free or die for it. The scheme was never carried out, but 2 years later, in Gloucester County, servants again planned a general uprising. One of them gave the plot away, and 4 were executed. The informer was given his freedom and 500,000 pounds of tobacco. Despite the rarity of servants' rebellions, the threat was always there, and masters were fearful. Finding their situation intolerable, rebellion impractical, in an increasingly organized society, servants reacted in individual ways. The files of the county courts in New England show that one servant struck at his master with a pitchfork. An apprentice servant was accused of laying violent hands upon his master and throwing him down twice and fetching blood of him, threatening to break his neck, running at his face with a chair. One maidservant was brought into court for being bad, unruly, sullen, careless, destructive, and disobedient. After the participation of servants in Bacon's rebellion, the Virginia legislature passed laws to punish servants who rebelled. The preamble to the act said, "Whereas many evil-disposed servants in these late times of horrid rebellion, taking advantage of the looseness and liberty of the time, did depart from their service and followed the rebels in rebellion, wholly neglecting their masters, employing whereby the said masters have suffered great damage and injury." Okay. 2 companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, saying, "One second. Okay, moving on. Two companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, saying, "Virginia is at present poor and more populous than ever. There is great apprehension of a rising among the servants, owing to their great necessities and want of clothes. They may plunder the storehouse and ships." Escape was easier than rebellion. Numerous instances of mass desertions by white servants took place in the southern colonies, reports Richard Morris on the basis of an inspection of colonial newspapers in the 1700s. The atmosphere of 17th century Virginia, he said, was charged with plots and rumors of combinations of servants to run away. The Maryland court records show in the 1650s a conspiracy of a dozen servants to seize a boat and to resist with arms if intercepted. They were captured and whipped. The mechanism of control was formidable. Strangers had to show passports or certificates to prove they were freemen. Agreements among the colonies provided for the extradition of fugitive servants. These became the basis of the clause in the U.S. Constitution that persons held to service or labor in one scape, escaping into another, shall be delivered up. The cause of the Civil War. Sometimes servants went on strike. One Maryland master complained to the provincial court in 1663 that his servants did peremptorily and positively refused to go and do their ordinary labor. The servants responded that they were fed only beans and bread and were so weak. We are not able to perform the employments he puts us upon. They were given 30 lashes by the court. This book is so good, but it also makes me sad. It's so many specifics. Oh my god. Which is good. More than half the colonists who came to the North American shores in the colonial period came as servants. They were mostly English in the 17th century, Irish and German in the 18th century. More and more slaves replaced them as they ran away to freedom or finished their time. But as late as 1755, white servants made up 10% of the population of Maryland. What happened to these servants after they became free? There are cheerful accounts in which they rise to prosperity, becoming landowners and important figures. But Abbot Smith, after a careful study, concludes that colonial society was not democratic and certainly not egalitarian. It was dominated by men who had money enough to make others work for them. And few of these men were descended from indentured servants, and practically none had themselves been of that class. So what happened to them? After we make our way through Abbot Smith's disdain for the servants as men and women who were dirty and lazy, rough, ignorant, lewd, and often criminal, who thieved and wandered, had bastard children, and corrupted society with loathsome diseases, Jesus Christ, we find that about 1 in 10 was a sound and solid individual, who would, if fortunate, survive his work out his time, take up land, and wax decently prosperous. Who was Abbot Smith again? Abbot Smith, after a careful study, he wrote a book or something. He wrote that one book that nope, that's Richard Morris. Who the fuck is Abbot Smith? The guy's an asshole. He wrote Colonists in Bondage. Okay, that makes sense. It came out 1947. It doesn't make sense, honestly. What the hell? Perhaps 1 in 10 would become of the indentured servants. Perhaps 1 in 10 would become an artisan or an overseer. The rest, 80%, who were certainly shiftless, hopeless, ruined individuals, either died during their servitude, returned to England after it was over, or became poor whites. They were already poor white. What is... Smith's conclusion is supported by a more recent study of servants in 17th century Maryland, where it was found that the first batches of servants became landowners and politically active in the colony, but by the second half of the century, more than half the servants, even after 10 years of freedom, remained landless. Servants became tenants, provided cheap labor for the large planters, both during and after their servitude. Providing cheap labor, both during and after their servitude. It seems quite clear that class lines hardened through the colonial period. The distinction between rich and poor became sharper. By 1700, there were 50 families in Virginia with wealth equivalent to £50,000, a huge sum those days, who lived off the labor of black slaves and white servants, owned the plantations, sat on the governor's council, served as local magistrates. In Maryland, the settlers were ruled by a proprietor whose right of total control over the colony had been granted by the English king. Between 1650 and 1689, there were 5 revolts against the proprietor. In the Carolinas, the fundamental constitutions were written in the 1660s by John Locke, who is considered the philosophical father of the founding fathers and the American system. Locke's constitution set up a feudal-type aristocracy in which 8 barons would own 40% of the colony's land, and only a baron could be a governor. When the Crown took direct control of North Carolina after a rebellion against the land arrangements, rich spectators seized 500,000 acres for themselves, monopolizing the good farming land near the coast. Poor people, desperate for land, squatted on bits of farmland and fought all through the pre-revolutionary period against the landlord's attempt to collect rent. Carl Bridenbaugh's study of colonial cities in the wilderness, reveals a clear-cut class system. He finds the leaders of early Boston were gentlemen of considerable wealth, who, in association with the clergy, eagerly sought to preserve in America the social arrangements of the mother country. By means of their control of trade and commerce, by their political domination of the inhabitants through church and town meetings, and by careful marriage alliances amongst themselves, members of this little oligarchy laid the foundations for an aristocratic class in 17th century Boston. At the very start of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, the governor, John Winthrop, had declared the philosophy of the rulers. In all times, some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjugation. Rich merchants erected mansions. Persons of quality traveled in coaches or sedan chairs, and their portraits painted had their portraits painted, wore periwigs, and filled themselves with rich food and Madeira, which is, of course, as we all know, a wine. A wine? Yes. Yes, made on the island of Madeira. Madeira.
Madeira.
Madeira. A petition came from the town of Deerfield in 1678 to the Massachusetts General Court. You may be pleased to know that the very principle and best of the land, the best for soil, the best for situation, as laying in ye center and middle of the town, as to quantity near half belongs unto 8 or 9 proprietors. Oh, okay. A petition came from the town of Deerfield to the Massachusetts General Court. You may be pleased to know that the very principle and the best of the land, the best for soil, the best for situation, as laying in ye center and middle of the town, and as to quantity, near half belongs unto 8 or 9 proprietors. In Newport, Rhode Island, Bridenbaugh found, as in Boston, that the town meetings, while ostensibly democratic, were in reality controlled year after year by the same group of merchant aristocrats, who secured most of the important offices. A contemporary described the Newport merchants as men in flaming scarlet coats and waistbands, laced and fringed with the brightest glaring yellow. The sly Quakers not venturing on these charming coats, and waistcoats, yet loving finery, figured away with plate on their sideboards. The sly Quakers, not venturing on these charming coats and waistcoats, yet loving finery, figured away with plate on their sideboards. The New York aristocracy was the most ostentatious of all. Bridenbaugh tells of window hangings of camlet, Janpan tables, gold-framed looking glasses, spinets, and massive 8-day clocks, richly carved furniture, jewels and silver plate, black house servants. I'm so cooked. Okay, time for another break. Welcome back. Woof. Woof. We still have 10 pages. Let's get through it. Set another Pomodoro. Yes. Okay. The New York aristocracy was the most ostentatious of all. Bridenbaugh tells of many ostentatious. Characterized by vulgar or pretentious display, designed to impress or attract notice.
Ostentatious.
That's what I said. Okay, cool. New York in the colonial period was like a feudal kingdom. The Dutch had set up a patronship system along the Hudson River with enormous landed estates where the barons controlled completely the lives of their tenants. In 1689, many of the grievances of the poor were mixed up in the farmers' revolts of Jacob Leisler and his group. Leisler was hanged, and the parceling out of huge estates continued. Under Governor Benjamin Fletcher, 3/4 of the land in New York was granted to about 30 people. He gave a friend a 500,000 acres for a token annual payment of 30 shillings. Under Lord Cornbury in the early 1700s, one grant to a group of spectators was for 2 million acres. One grant for a group of speculators was for 2 million acres. That's crazy. In 1700, New York City church wardens had asked for funds from the Common Council because the cries of the poor and impotent for want of relief are extremely grievous. In the 1730s, a demand began to grow for institutions to contain the many beggarly people daily suffered to wander about the streets. A city council resolution read, Whereas the necessity, number and continual increase of the poor within the city is very great, and frequently commit divers misdemeanors within the said city, who, living idly and unemployed, became debauched and instructed in the practice of thievery and debauchery. For remedy whereof, resolved that there be forthwith built a good, strong, and convenient house and tenement. Build the poorhouse. The 2-story brick structure was called poorhouse, workhouse, and house of correction. A letter to Peter Zenger's New York Journal in 1737 described the poor street urchin of New York as an object in human shape, half starved with cold, with clothes out at the elbows, knees through the breeches, hair standing on end. From the age about 4 to 14, they spend their days in the streets. Then they are put out as apprentices, perhaps 4, 5, or 6 years. The colonies grew fast in the 1700s. English settlers were joined by Scottish, Irish, and German immigrants. Okay, there's a crow that is making a lot of noise, but I don't think you can hear it on the mic at all. It's good. It's a good mic, I guess. There's a lot of noises going on right now. I am chronically distractable. Let's move on. Actually, let me see. The colonies grew fast in the 1700s. English settlers were joined by Scotch, Irish, and German immigrants. Black slaves were pouring in. They were 8% of the population in 1690, 21% in 1770. The population of the colonies was 250,000 in 1700. 1,600,000 by 1760. Jesus Christ. Agriculture was growing, small manufacturing was developing, shipping and trading were expanding. The big cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, were doubling and tripling in size. Although all that growth, the upper class was getting most of the benefits and monopolized political power. A historian who studied Boston tax lists in 1687 and 1771 found that in 1687 there were, out of the population of 6,000, about 1,000 property owners, and that the top 5%, 1% of the population, consisted of 50 rich individuals who had 25% of the wealth. There's a fly in this room, and it's driving me crazy. Okay, that was in... Oh, wait. Oh. Okay, that was 1687. By 1770, the top 1% of property owners owned 44% of the wealth. As Boston grew from 1687 to 1770, the percentage of adult males who were poor, perhaps rented a room or slept in the back of a tavern, owned no property, doubled from 14% of the adult males to 29%. And loss of property meant loss of voting rights. Everywhere the poor were struggling to stay alive, simply to keep from freezing in cold weather. All the cities built poorhouses in the 1730s, not just for old people, widows, crippled, and orphans, but for unemployed, war veterans, and new immigrants. In New York at mid-century, the city almshouse, built for 100 poor, was housing over 400. A Philadelphia citizen wrote in 1748, "It is remarkable what an increase of the number of beggars there are. It is remarkable what an increase of the number of beggars there is about this town this winter." In 1757, Boston officials spoke of a great number of poor who can scarcely procure from day to day daily bread for themselves and families. Kenneth Lockridge, in a study of colonial New England, found that vagabonds and paupers kept increasing, and the wandering poor were a distinct fact of New England life in the middle 1700s. James T. Lemon and Gary Nash found a similar concentration of wealth, a widening of the gap between rich and poor, in their study of Chester County, Pennsylvania in the 1700s. The colonies, it seemed, were societies of contending classes, a fact obscured by the emphasis in traditional histories on the external struggle against England, the unity of colonists in the Revolution. That's so true. The country, therefore, was not born free, but born slave and free, servant and master, tenant and landlord, poor and rich. As a result, the political authorities were frequently vociferously, and sometimes violently, according to Nash. Outbreaks of disorder punctuated the last quarter of the 17th century, toppling established governments in Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Free white workers were better off than slaves or servants, but they still resented unfair treatment by the wealthier classes. As early as 1637, an employer off the coast of Maine reported that his workmen and fishermen fell into a mutiny because he had withheld their wages. They deserted en masse. 5 years later, carpenters in Maine, protesting against inadequate food, engaged in a slowdown. At the Gloucester shipyards in the 1640s, what Richard Morris calls the first lockout in American labor history took place, when authorities took a group of troublesome shipwrights they could not work a stroke of work more. When the authorities told a group of troublesome shipwrights they could not work a stroke of work more. The first lockout. Okay. There were early strikes of coopers, butchers, bakers protesting against government There were early strikes of coopers, butchers, bakers protesting against government control of the fees they charged. Porters in the 1650s in New York refused to carry salt, and carters, which were truckers, teamsters, carriers, who went on strike, were prosecuted in New York City for not obeying the command and doing their duties as becomes them in their places. Oh my gosh. as becomes them in their places. In 1741, bakers combined to refuse to bake because they had to pay such high prices for wheat. A severe food shortage in Boston in 1713 brought a warning from town selectmen to the General Assembly of Massachusetts, saying, "The threatening scarcity of provisions had led to such extravagant prices that the necessities of the poor in the approaching winter must needs be very pressing. Must needs be very pressing." Okay, needs to be taken seriously. Okay. Andrew Belcher, a wealthy merchant who was exporting grain to the Caribbean because the profit was greater there. On May 19th, 200 people rioted on the Boston Common. They attacked Belcher's ships, broke into his warehouses looking for corn, and shot the lieutenant governor when he tried to interfere. Eight years after the bread riot on the Common, a pamphleter protesting against those who became rich by grinding the poor, by studying how to oppress, cheat, and overreach their neighbors. He denounced the rich, great, and potent, who, with rapacious violence, aggressively greedy or grasping. Who, with rapacious violence, bear down all before them. In the 1730s in Boston, people protesting the high prices established by merchants demolished the public market in Dock Square, while, as a conservative writer complained, murmuring against the government and the rich people. No one was arrested after the demonstrators warned that arrest would bring 500 men in solemn league and covenant who would destroy other markets set up for the benefit of rich merchants. No one was arrested after the demonstrators warned that arrests would bring 500 men in solemn league and covenant who would destroy other markets set up for the benefit of rich merchants. That's cool. Okay. Seven more pages. Jesus Christ. Around the same time, in New York, an election pamphlet urged New York voters to join Shuttle the Waver, Plane the Joiner, Drive the Carter, Mortar the Mason, Tar the Mariner, Ship the Tailor, Small Rent the fair mining landlord, and John Poor the tenant, against Gripe the merchant, Squeeze the shopholder, Spin text and Quibble the lawyer. Huh? An election pamphlet urged. Snip the tailor, Small Rent the fair-minded landlord, and John Poor the tenant, against Gripe the merchant, Squeeze the shopkeeper, Spin text and Quibble the lawyer. Okay. The electorate was urged to vote out of office people in exalted stations who scorned those they called the vulgar, the mob, the herd of mechanics. In the 1730s, a committee of the Boston Town meeting spoke out for Bostonians in debt who wanted paper money issued to make it easier to pay off their debts to the merchant elite. They did not want, they declared, to have our bread and water measured out to us by those who riot in luxury and wantonness on our sweat and toil. Bostonians rioted also against impressment, in which men were drafted for naval service. They surrounded the house of the governor, beat up the sheriff, locked up a sheriff deputy, and stormed the townhouse where the general court sat. The militia did not respond when called to put them down, and the governor fled. The crowd was condemned by a merchants' group as a riotous, tumultuous assembly of foreign seamen, servants, negroes, and other persons of mean and vile condition. In New Jersey in the 1740s and 50s, poor farmers occupying land over which they and their landowners had rival claims, rioted when rents were demanded of them. In 1745, Samuel Baldwin, who had long lived on his land and who held an Indian title to it, was arrested for non-payment of rent to the proprietor and taken to the Newark jail. A contemporary described what happened then. The people, in general, supposing the design of the proprietors was to ruin them, went to the prison, opened the door, and took out Baldwin. When 2 men who freed Baldwin were arrested, hundreds of New Jersey citizens gathered around the jail. A report sent by the New Jersey government to the Lords of Trade in London described the scene. That's so cool. Okay. 2 of the new captains in the Newark. I need to know how to spell that because it's important.
Newark.
2 of the new captains of the Newark companies, by the sheriff's order, went out with their drums to the people so met. And required all persons there belonged to their companies to follow the drums, and to defend the prison, but none followed, though many were there. The multitude between 4 and 5 of the clock in the afternoon lighted off their horses and came towards the goal, huzzahing and swinging their clubs, till they came within reach of the guard, struck them with their clubs, and the guard, having no orders to fire, returned the blows with their guns, and some were wounded on both sides, but none killed. The multitude broke the rank of the soldiers, and pressed on the prison door, where the sheriff stood with the sword, and kept them off, till they gave him several blows, and forced him out from thence. They then, with axes and other instruments, broke down the prison door, and took out the 2 prisoners, as also one other prisoner who was confined for debt, and went away. Dope. 2 of the new captains of the Newark companies, by the sheriff's order, went with their drums to the people so met, and required all persons there belonging to their companies to follow the drums. Oh, the Newark companies, because captains of the New York companies. They were like paid militias by like companies. Were they mercenaries? The mercenaries said, I don't want to deal with that. Good for them. Through this period, England was fighting a series of wars. Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, King George's War in the 1730s. Some merchants made fortunes from these wars, but for most people they meant higher taxes, unemployment, poverty. An anonymous pamphleteer in Massachusetts, writing angrily about King George's War, described the situation. Poverty and discontent appear in every face, except the countenances of the rich, and dwell upon every tongue. He spoke of a few men fed by lust of power, lust of fame, lust of money, who got rich during the war. No wonder such men can build ships, houses, buy farms, set up their coaches, chariots, live very splendidly, purchase fame, posts of honor. He called them birds of prey, enemies to all communities, wherever they live. Ooh. Get 'em. Time for a break. I will be back in 4 minutes to finish this chapter at long last, and then I will be done for the day. Fourth Pomodoro. Is this? Yes, this is the fourth Pomodoro. Okay. Sorry, too much clapping. And last section of this chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages left. Okay. Through this period, England was fighting a series of wars. Ah, yes. Okay. Enemies to all communities wherever they live. The forced service of seamen led to a riot against impressment in which is joining the Navy in Boston. Ah, yes, forced. Oh my god. Okay. The forced service of seamen led to a riot against impressment in Boston in 1747. Then crowds turned against Thomas Hutchinson, a rich merchant and colonial officer who had backed the governor in putting down the riot, and who also designed a currency plan for Massachusetts which seemed to discriminate against the poor. Hutchinson's house burned down, mysteriously, and a crowd gathered in the street, cursing Hutchinson and shouting, "Let it burn!" By the years of the Revolutionary Crisis, the 1760s, the wealthy elite that controlled the British colonies of the American mainland on the American mainland had 150 years of experience, had learned certain things about how to rule. They had various fears, but also had developed tactics to deal with what they feared. The Indians, they had found, were too unruly to keep as labor force and remained an obstacle to expansion. Black slaves were easier to control, and their profitability for southern plantations was bringing an enormous increase in the importation of slaves. Was bringing an enormous increase in the importation of slaves, who were becoming a majority in some colonies, and constituted 1/5 of the entire colonial population. Okay. But the blacks were not totally submissive, and their numbers grew. The prospect of slave rebellion grew. And as their numbers grew, the prospect of slave rebellion grew. With the problem of Indian hostility and the dangers of slave revolts, the colonial elite had to consider the class anger of poor whites. Servants, tenants, the city poor, the propertyless, the taxpayer, the soldier and sailor. As the colonies passed their 100th year and went into the middle of the 1700s, as the gap between rich and poor widened, as violence and the threat of violence increased, the problem of control became more serious. What if these different despised groups, the Indians, the slaves, the poor whites, should combine? Even before there were so many blacks in the 17th century, there was, as Abbott Smith puts it, a lively fear that servants would join the Negroes or Indians to overcome the small number of masters. There was little chance that whites and Indians would combine in North America as they were doing in South and Central America. There was little chance that whites and Indians would combine in North America as they were doing in South and Central America, where the shortage of women and the use of Indians on the plantation led to daily contact. Only in Georgia and South Carolina, where white women were scarce, was there some sexual mixing of white men and Indian women. In general, the Indian had been pushed out of sight, out of touch. One fact disturbed. Whites would run off to join Indian tribes, or would be captured in battle and brought up among the Indians, and when this happened, the whites, given a chance to leave, chose to stay in the Indian culture. Indians, having the choice, almost never decided to join the whites. Hector Street Jean Crevecoeur, the Frenchman who lived in America for almost 20 years, told in Letters from an American Farmer how children captured during the 7 Years' War and found by their parents, grown up and living with the Indians, would refuse to leave their new families. Families. Oh my God. That's too hot. There must be, in their social bond, he said, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us. For thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those Aboriginal, I don't know. Okay. Having from choice become Europeans. It means, I don't know. I have enough context. Indigenous people. Okay, I'm just getting, okay, that's not the Aborigines. Focus. Okay. But this affected few people. In general, the Indian was kept at a distance, and the colonial officialdom had found a way of alleviating the danger. By monopolizing the good land on the eastern seaboard, they forced the landless whites to move westward to the frontier, there to encounter the Indians and to be a buffer for the seaboard rich against Indian troubles, while becoming more dependent on the government for protection. Bacon's rebellion was instructive. To conciliate a diminishing Indian to conciliate a diminishing Indian population at the expense of infuriating a coalition of white frontiersmen was very risky. To conciliate. We're learning new words. Stop someone from being angry or discontent. To pacify. So, to conciliate a diminishing Indian population. To pacify diminishing at the expense of infuriating a coalition. Okay. I see. Oh, the next sentence. Please just keep reading. Oh my God. Better to make war on the Indian, gain the support of the white, divert possible class conflict by turning poor whites against the Indians for the security of the elite. Might blacks and Indians combine against the white enemy? In the northern colonies, except on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Rhode Island, where there was close contact and sexual mingling. In the northern colonies, except for where there was not much opportunity for Africans and Indians to meet in large numbers. New York had the largest slave population in the north, and there was some contact between blacks and Indians, as in 1712 when Africans and Indians joined in an insurrection, but this was quickly suppressed. In the Carolinas, however, whites were outnumbered by black slaves and nearby Indian tribes. In the 1950s, 25,000 whites faced 40,000 black slaves with 60,000 Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw Indians.
Choctaw.
Okay. Gary Nash writes, Indian uprisings that punctuated the colonial period and a succession of slave uprisings and insurrectionary plots that were nipped in the bud kept Carolinians sickeningly aware that only through the greatest vigilance and through policies designed to keep their enemies divided could they hope to remain in control of the situation. Oh my god. Okay. Damn, so this, okay. They were nipped in the bud. The white rulers of the Carolinas seemed to be conscious of the need for a policy, as one of them put it, to make Indians and Negroes a check upon each other, lest by their vastly superior numbers we should be crushed by one or the other. And so laws were passed prohibiting free blacks from traveling in Indian country. Treaties with Indian tribes contained clauses requiring the return of fugitive slaves. Governor Littleton of South Carolina wrote in 1738, "It has always been the policy of this government to create an aversion in them, the Indians, to Negroes." Part of this policy involved using black slaves in the South Carolina militia to fight Indians. Still, the government was worried about black revolt, and during the Cherokee War in the 1670s, a motion to equip 500 slaves to fight the Indians lost in the Carolina Assembly by a single vote. Blacks ran away to the Indian villages, and the Crees and Cherokees harbored runaway slaves by the hundreds. Many of these were amalgamated into the Indian tribes, married, produced children, but the combination of harsh slave codes and bribes to the Indians to help put down black rebels kept things under control. It was the potential combination of poor whites and blacks that caused the most fear among the wealthy white planters. Hello? If there had been the natural racial repugnance that some theorists have assumed, control would have been easier. But sexual attraction was powerful across racial lines. In 1743, a grand jury of Charleston, South Carolina, denounced the too common practice of criminal conversation with Negro and other slave wenches in this province. Mixed offspring continued to be produced by white-black sex relations throughout the colonial period, in spite of laws prohibiting interracial marriage. In Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, and Georgia. By declaring the children illegitimate, they would keep them inside the black families, so that the white population could remain pure and in control. What made Bacon's rebellion especially fearsome for the rulers of Virginia was that black slaves and white servants joined forces. The final surrender was by 400 English and Negroes in arms at one garrison, and 300 freemen and African and English bond servants in another garrison, 400 and 300. The naval commander who subdued the 400 wrote, "Most of them I persuaded to go to their homes, which accordingly they did, except about 80 Negroes and 20 English, which would not deliver their arms." All through those early years, black and white slaves and servants ran away together, as shown both by the laws passed to stop this and the records of the courts. In 1698, South Carolina passed a deficiency law requiring plantation owners to have at least one white servant for every 6 male adult Negroes. A letter from the southern colonies in 1682 complained of no white men to superintend our Negroes. Oh, or repress an insurrection of Negroes. So like the trustees, I guess. The deficiency law. In 1691, the House of Commons received a petition of divers merchants, masters. Oh, a petition of divers merchants, masters of ships, planters, and others trading to foreign plantations. Setting forth that the plantation cannot be maintained without a considerable number of white servants as well to keep the blacks in subjugation, as to bear arms in case of invasion. A report to the English government in 1721 said that in South Carolina, black slaves have lately attempted and were very near succeeding in a new revolution, and therefore it may be necessary to propose some new law for encouraging the entertainment of more white servants in the future. The militia of this province does not consist of above 2,000 men. Apparently 2,000 were not considered sufficient to meet the threat. Oh, what? We're almost done. Oh my gosh. This fear may help explain why Parliament in 1717 made transportation to the New World a legal punishment for crime. After that, tens of thousands of convicts could be sent to Virginia, Maryland, and other colonies. It also makes understandable why the Virginia Assembly, after Bacon's Rebellion, gave amnesty to white servants who had rebelled, but not to blacks. Negroes were forbidden to carry any arms, while whites, finishing their servitude, would get muskets, along with corn and cash. The distinction of status between white and black servants became more and more clear. In the 1720s, with fear of slave rebellion growing, white servants were allowed in Virginia to join the militias as substitutes for white freemen. At the same time, slave patrols were established in Virginia to deal with the great dangers that may happen by the insurrections of the Negroes. Poor white men would make up the rank and file of these patrols and get the monetary reward. Racism was becoming more and more practical. Edmund Morgan, on the basis of his careful study of slavery in Virginia, sees racism not as natural to black-white differences, but something coming out of class scorn, a realistic device for control. If freemen with disappointed hopes could make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous black slaves by a screen of racial contempt. There was another control which became handy as the colonies grew, and which had crucial consequences for the continued rule of the elite throughout American history. Along with the very rich and the very poor, there developed a white middle class of small planters, independent farmers, city artisans, who, given small rewards for joining forces with merchants and planters, would be a solid buffer against black slaves, frontier Indians, and very poor whites. The growing cities generated more skilled workers, and the governments cultivated the support of white mechanics by protecting them from the competition of both slaves and free Negroes. The growing cities generated more skilled, and the governments cultivated the support of the white mechanics by protecting them from competition. Gotcha. History sucks. Where was I? As early as 1686, the council in New York ordered that no Negro or slave be suffered to work on the bridge as a porter. Be suffered to work. Oh my god. Come on, 2 more pages. Not even, like 1.5. The council in New York ordered that no Negro or slave be suffered to work on the bridge as a porter about any goods either imported or exported from or into this city. In the southern towns, too, white craftsmen and traders were protected from Negro competition. In 1764, the South Carolina legislature prohibited Charleston masters from employing Negroes or other slaves as mechanics or in handicraft trades. (1686). Middle-class Americans might be invited to join a new elite by a tax. Against the corruption of the established rich. The New Yorker Cadwallader Colden, in his address to the free householders in 1747, attacked the wealthy as tax dodgers, unconcerned with the welfare of others, although he himself was wealthy, and spoke for the honest and dependability of the middling rank of mankind, in whom citizens could trust our liberty and property. This was to become a critically important rhetorical device for the rule of the few, who would speak to the many of our liberty, our property, our country. Similarly, in Boston, the rich James Otis could appeal to the Boston middle class by attacking the Tory Thomas Hutchinson. James Henretta has shown that while it was the rich who ruled Boston, there were political jobs available for the moderately well-off, as cullers of staves, measurers of coal baskets, fence viewer, Aubrey Land found in Maryland a class of small planters It's time for a long break. It's actually time for me to be done after this page because the next chapter is here. Aubrey Land found in Maryland a class of small planters who were not the beneficiary of the planting society as the rich were, but who had the distinction of being called planters, and who were respectable citizens with community obligations to act as overseers of roads, appraisers of estates, and similar duties. It helped the alliance to accept the middle class socially. It helped the alliance to accept the middle class socially in a round of activities that included local politics, dances, horse racing, and cockfights, occasionally punctuated with drinking brawls. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote in 1756, "The people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and at present pretty much upon a level." Okay, like the leveling that they were taught, right? They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers, or men in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks that he has a right to civility from the greatest. I think meanest meanings like the smallest, like the poorest amongst them. Does it actually mean like unkind? Don't think so. Indeed, there was a substantial middle class fitting that description. To call them the people was to omit black slaves, white servants, and displaced Indians. And the term middle class concealed a fact long true about this country, that, as Richard Hofstadter said, it was a middle class society governed for the most part by its upper classes. Those upper classes, to rule, needed to make concessions to the middle class without damage to their own wealth or power, at the expense of slaves, Indians, and poor whites. This bought loyalty, and to bind that loyalty with something more powerful even than material, and to bind that loyalty with something more powerful than even material advantage, the ruling group found in the 1760s and 1770s a wonderfully useful device. That device was the language of liberty and equality, which could unite just enough whites to fight a revolution against England without ending either slavery or inequality. Damn. Tyranny is Tyranny is chapter 4. What was this chapter called? Persons of mean and vile condition. This book is really good. It's Friday and I'm done for the week. I will come back next Monday at 9 a.m. with hopefully a better plan for reading more. I think that reading aloud is actually slowing me down a lot. And I think that I want to read out loud, because if I'm just reading to myself, I won't do that. But we'll see. Maybe I'll read it quietly and then I'll read it out loud to try to get a good audio clip for a audiobook. Even though there are so many audiobooks, actually, now that I looked at it, there are some really good quality audiobooks of this book. Maybe I'll play the audio books. Perhaps. I don't know. I'll see you Monday at 9 a.m. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. And I'll see you on the next one.